You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Instead of them coming from up in the air, they're coming from the middle of the Atlantic.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 17. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader, and today we're talking about Atlantis. How did the story get started? What are the actual facts behind it? And how is it portrayed today? We also have a couple of fun rants from Ken and I, both on completely unrelated topics, but totally worth listening to. So I hope you stick around and get ready to think critically.
Digging in a trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day is spent. Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader.
Hi, Sarah.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
Okay, and today we are going to discuss the never-ending topic of Atlantis.
The lost continent of Atlantis.
Yes.
Cue the
Lost
spooky
in-
music right there.
Right? Lost in so many places. It's been found, 12
my
times
God.
now?
Listen, it's like every year somebody finds Atlantis someplace else.
Well, and it's been found in outer space a couple times too,
I
hasn't
think
it?
on Mars, maybe, yeah.
Right? Or is Nibiru, Planet X, supposed to be Atlantis?
That's a new one for me, but you know what? I wouldn't put it past it.
Probably. Yeah, somewhere probably. We just started that one. We copyrighted that.
There you go.
Okay, so the story of Atlantis is very enduring. It's been around for a really long time. Longer than not as long. It's a Victorian idea, isn't it?
Well, the story of Atlantis starts 2,400 years ago with Plato, so it's millennia old.
Right. But the idea of Atlantis being an actual physical location, because when Plato was telling his stories, if you actually read the two dialogues, it's obvious that he's not talking about it as an actual physical place.
Well, I mean, that's true when most people, philosophers of science and historians and archaeologists read Timaeus and Critias, the two dialogues where Plato brings up Atlantis. It's obvious to us that there are lots of signals in the dialogues that Plato's making this stuff up. But for some people, they read some of it very, very literally, and they believe, no, that Plato was talking about a real place, a real continent. And you're right. Most of the folks who were contemporaries of Plato read that, and they understood that Plato was producing an allegory, a story that was meant to tell a lesson. But fairly early on, there were these rumblings that, well, maybe there's something to this, but it really isn't. I mean, it doesn't become a kind of cause célèbre, I think, really until the 19th century, when Ignatius Donnelly, an American writer, writes his book in 1881, 1882, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, the world before the flood. And that's when there were people before him who said it was real, but it was Donnelly, I think, who becomes the supreme popularizer. In a sense, Donnelly is like the Eric von Daniken of Atlantisology.
Yeah.
Where von Daniken was certainly not the first person to say, gee, maybe the archaeological record reflects the visits of extraterrestrial aliens in antiquity, but he certainly was the kind of a sea change occurs when von Daniken publishes Chariots of the Gods, when that's published in Europe.
He's the one that brings it to the forefront and makes it popular.
Yeah, and I think Donnelly deserves the same well, we can call it credit or blame, but certainly it's Donnelly who makes this the modern discussions of Atlantis, the things today that you'll see on cable TV, I think can be traced back. That Donnelly is kind of the ground zero of that modern discussion.
Now, before Donnelly, there were people who made some rumblings that maybe Atlantis was a real place, and there's no real way to track all those people down, and I'm not going to bother with it. But I want people to be aware that did happen, and I want to do a thought experiment real quick before we get into the meat of this, and pretend for a minute that Plato's stories were talking about a real place, or that we could somehow trace it back to a real place. And the problem that I run into there, on top of everything else, but the big sticking point for me is that the story, as it is told by, is it Critias who tells the story?
Critias.
He's the one
Jr.
that tells the story.
Right, Critias. Yeah, the context is that Plato is kind of the transcriber, the stenographer of a conversation between Socrates, who really was a real guy, and Plato was a real guy, and Plato was a student of Socrates. So he's transcribing what's going on in a school where Socrates is the teacher, and Critias and Timaeus and Hermocrates and a bunch of these other guys are chatting up a whole bunch of philosophical concepts. And so,
and he gives them the thought experiment of create the perfect society and then send them to war.
Well, the deal is what in the dialogue that in the dialogues, what Plato says is that Socrates comes in essentially to a classroom and starts by saying, hey, remember that conversation we all were having yesterday about the perfect society? Now, when you read that, if you know Plato's works, you know that what he's referring to, already Plato's making stuff up, because the conversation about the perfect society and all the things that then are enumerated in this conversation in the Critias dialogue, these things all appear in a previous book that Plato wrote called The Republic, which may be one of his most famous works. But we know, Socrates certainly knew this, that The Republic had been published several years before. So immediately, Plato is nodding and winking to people who know his work that when Socrates says, well, remember we talked about this yesterday, in the time period that Plato is creating for this dialogue, we know that's already a lie. Because we know
it's a sequel.
It's a sequel but again, it is. It's like watching a movie that's we did the first one 5 years ago, but the fiction is that today is the next day. It's like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or something. Right. And the movie was made a while ago, but we're going to pretend that today is the day after the last thing you saw in the movie.
Right.
And you're right. So what Socrates says is, remember that perfect society. I gave you this thought experiment that you brought up. I gave you guys an assignment, which is let's show how that perfect society is perfect. Socrates there's this kind of beautiful conversation or monologue that Socrates provides where he says, when we're talking hypothetically about this perfect society, I might compare myself to someone who is seeing a painting of an animal. I've never seen the animal. I'm seeing a painting. Would I really understand the soul of that animal? And when I talk about this in class, I show my students a photograph of a lion lying on its back like asleep. And I said, if that's the only thing you ever saw, the only contact you ever had, the only experience you had with that particular animal, would you really know what a lion was like? And then I show them a video of a pride of lions taking down a zebra. And it's horrible if you're the zebra, but the lions they're magnificent and superb hunters, and that's the essence of a lion. And that's what Socrates says. I'm like the guy seeing the lion lying on his back, and is that what a lion is? So what I need from this hypothetical conversation is I need one of you people, and he gives them the assignment to engage our society in a war that shows how they rise to that occasion, how they're magnanimous and brave and courageous and powerful and smart, and how they defeat some evil power in this war. It's a homework assignment that Socrates gives the students. And that's when, and it is, I think, the funny part, Critias doesn't raise his hand and say, oh, Socrates, I have a story. Somebody else in the group raises his hand and says, oh, Socrates? Yeah, it's a funny thing. When we had that conversation yesterday, Critias started talking about the perfect society. So he's got a story. Which probably meant that guy was, Critias was going to go beat that guy up after class for volunteering him.
He got volunteered.
Exactly. And that's the context where Critias then says, and maybe this is the most confusing part of it to people who say, but I hear this a lot, and this bothers me. Plato said that Atlantis, that the story was real. And that's when I have to remind people, no, actually, Plato didn't say anything. Critias does. And Critias, did Plato put those words in Critias's mouth? Well, sure, but Critias is a character in a philosophical drama.
Exactly.
Now, we all understand that when one of the famous lines of Shakespeare, it's like Henry the Fifth, Sixth, or whatever the play is, where it's Dick the Butcher, and Dick the Butcher, he's a badass, and he says to one of his buddies, you know what, when we're in charge, first thing we're going to do, kill the lawyers. And it's like, yeah, we're going to kill the lawyers. Now, I've never heard anybody say, oh my God, Shakespeare said we should kill the lawyers. Hell no. A character in a play that Shakespeare wrote said that. That doesn't mean that Shakespeare believed we should kill the lawyers. And it's the same thing. When Critias says, listen, Plato, now to a story which, though amazing, it's actually true. All that means is that when Plato is writing this story, he wants to lend an air of verisimilitude to this. If Critias had started by saying, listen, Socrates, to a story totally untrue, I'm just blowing smoke out of my ass, but it's a good story. Well, that's a good story. That takes away the drama. So often people writing fiction will present something as the truth, and we're supposed to suspend our disbelief and imagine for a moment that it really is true.
Well, here's a problem that people have is they have, if you told somebody today, if you gave them a modern fiction story and said, this is true, and they would look at you and they'd be like, no, this is a fiction story. I understand what fiction is. But that same person has a hard time looking at a story from the past and making the same distinction. For some reason, the older a story becomes, the more reliable it is. And I don't understand, because to me, it's the exact opposite. The older data becomes for me, the less reliable I think it is.
Right, yes.
And that's just because I've dealt with a lot of old documents, and this is what the neighborhood looked like in the 1920s, because that's what this text document says. Yeah, well, this is what the archaeology says, and that's completely different.
Right.
So I'm used to that, but a lot of people can't make that distinction for some reason. They get the modern fiction is fiction, but they can't get that historical fiction.
And Plato actually, in the words he put in Critias's mouth, he hints at that, because Critias does not tell Socrates and those guys in the dialogue, oh, this is a story that I've read. He says, this is a story that my grandfather told me, and he heard it from another guy, Hermocrates, and he heard it from another guy, Solon, and Solon heard it, he heard it from priests in Egypt, and there's hundreds of years separating Critias from the source of the story. So, I think that Plato is, again, letting us all know, hey, look, this isn't true. It's from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, and now I'm going to tell the story.
And that's the other big issue I have is if we pretend like there's a possibility for this to be real, the only information we have about it is fourth generation information.
Right.
And we don't even know who the originator of that information is. It's so old that we can't even remember who the first person was that had this information.
It was anonymous Egyptian priests. That's essentially what Critias is telling us.
Right. So, it is unreliable to the nth degree. Yes. You can't trust this story. And I think that's another real, not even subtle hint that we're given in the dialogue.
And it's also the case that, again, let's allow for the possibility that this was a real story, that Plato was telling people, hey, this thing is real, and that he intended people reading it to believe that, in fact, the Atlantis story was real. We run into a really big problem. That is, there are lots of other Greek writers at the time that Plato was writing, people who would have been aware of this story that Plato has written. And you would think that if these are historians really believing that Plato is saying, I have discovered probably the most significant event in Greek history that we didn't know anything about, where the ancient Athenians defeated an incredibly powerful, evil empire. If other historians read that, they're going to write about it, if only to dispute it. And what is it in between 342 and 339 BC? Isocrates wrote a historical work called Pan-Athenaikus. And he doesn't mention Atlantis. He doesn't mention the story, even to say, I don't think this is true.
Right.
And can you imagine, suppose the Revolutionary War was something we didn't know about. It had never been recorded. There's no physical evidence for it. But some guy at some university says, I've just found secret documents showing that America was once a colony of the British, and they fought this brave war to get our independence. Don't you think if that historians today, every university professor in America would rise to the occasion, would be interviewed on television? Well, what do you think about this? Do you think this is true?
Right.
So it simply doesn't make any sense that the claim that people of Plato's time believed that Plato was trying to tell us a real story. It makes no sense because nobody responds to it. And of course,
right.
I mean, it's sort of like, historians have never written articles about how Star Wars really didn't happen because, well, we all know in science.
We all know it did not actually happen.
You don't need to dispute something of course, it's a work of fiction. And I think that applying Occam's razor here, the explanation that requires the fewest other assumptions is the one to go with until you can disprove it. I think that the simplest, most direct and straightforward explanation for why other Greek writers didn't respond to the story of Atlantis is because they recognized it was a fiction.
And I think that's why it took so long for it to become. I mean, I'm sure there was a fringe group back in the day that believed that Atlantis was real and, probably people trying to sail to find it and all that kind of crap. But I think that's why it took so long for it to become a thing, because Plato's writings were used for educational purposes, and I mean, a classical education required an understanding of old document or old literature like that. It was just taught differently, is what I'm trying to say. And then you get into the 1900s, and it's far enough removed that you have informal education happening and people who are basically teaching themselves, and it's far enough removed from anybody who could actually definitively say, no, this is a story and this is why it's a story. And so you get Donnelly, he publishes his book. It's a fantastic story.
Oh yeah.
It's borrowing from a lot of other writers' traditions. I mean, it just takes the world basically. And it doesn't actually take it by storm, but it does become very popular and it plants a lot of seeds.
Right. And and here's the deal too, and this is why in an archaeology podcast we're getting back around to it. The evidence that Donnelly relies on to buttress his claim that the Atlantis story as told by Plato was the real thing, is much of that evidence is archaeological. So right. Donnelly has this entire section after section after section of his book in which basically what he does is he does the same thing. It's why this connection between Donnelly and von Däniken, I think, is really germane, and why the connection between von Däniken and Donnelly and just about all diffusionists, again, is important and germane and relevant, is that fundamentally Donnelly's argument is people are basically kind of dumb and slow and uninventive. And we need to explain human history, we need a single genius culture to develop, and that they spread they proselytize the religion of technological achievement and sophistication to all of the backward, slow, and less intelligent human groups around the world. So where some diffusionists used to say that, well, Egypt was the center of everything, and all cultures everywhere in the world they borrowed the ideas from Egypt. We talked about this last time with Afrocentrism, with borrowing agriculture and metallurgy and monumental architecture and math and science and calendars. Well, it all came from one place, Egypt. Donnelly's argument basically is, well, it all came from one place, and that place is an island in the middle of the Atlantic, a continent called Atlantis. So he literally looks at things like, well, there's agriculture in the old world, and there's agriculture in the new world. It's not possible that people on different sides of the planet could develop such an important and sophisticated technology, such as the domestication of plants and animals. So they must have gotten it from somewhere. Well, what's midway between the old world and the new world? The middle of the Atlantic. That's Atlantis. Huge pyramids. This is one of those deals where I think part of the problem here is our language is insufficient. That that if you go to a geometry textbook and you look up the term pyramid, a pyramid is a three-dimensional object that's four-sided. Each of the sides is a triangle, and the triangles all meet at a common apex. That's a really a technical definition of a pyramid. So when you look at the pyramids of Giza, for example, the Khufu's pyramid and Khafre's and Menkare's, those are true geometric pyramids. Four triangles, square base, they meet at a common apex. Donnelly says, see those pyramids in Egypt? There are pyramids in Mexico. Both the Egyptians and the Mexicans, ancient Native Americans, must have borrowed the idea of a pyramid from somewhere else, the somewhere else being Atlantis. But if you use the definition of pyramid, the geometric definition, these monumental structures in Mesoamerica are not pyramids.
Right.
They're truncated pyramids, which makes them not pyramids. Yeah, they got four sides, but each side is, what is it, like a rhombus? They're flat top. They don't come to that common apex.
And a lot of them don't have point. Yeah, like you were saying, they're flat top. They don't come to a point. They'll have small structures built on top of them. So
the point here is that our language fails us because we say, well, those are pyramids, those are pyramids. How could two different groups of people develop pyramids? It must have been a source somewhere in between. But the fact of the matter is that's a problem with our language. They're not the same structures. They don't look the same. They weren't built the same. Their functions are different. Egyptian pyramids were not meant to be climbed, right? They're artificial mountains, and the pharaoh is buried inside the pharaoh's retinue. They're buried inside. Mesoamerican pyramids are platforms. They're elevated platforms on tops of which are palaces or ceremonial structures, and there are stairs leading to the top. You go to Chichen Itza, you go to Uxmal, Palenque, Tikal. There are stairways leading to the tops where ceremonies were conducted. Those are, again, forget the fact that in our pitiful language, we only have one word for these large structures that are big on the bottom and narrow on the top, but they're not the same thing. So it's kind of crazy. Why, the Atlanteans, were they pulling our leg here? They said, well, let's teach the Egyptians to build one kind of pyramids. We'll teach the ancient Maya to build a completely different kind. It'll drive the archaeologists crazy.
Well, and I think that the time period that the stories were written was helpful to getting the story going too, because Atlantis, the antediluvian world, was published in 1882. Right. So archaeology, again, is still a very young field. The things that are being published are just kind of all over the place. Not everybody, people have less of an understanding of what archaeology is and how it works in the late 1800s, early 1900s than they do even today, where you could Google the term and have a 5-page Wikipedia entry on it. So, maybe he's not exactly playing off of the people of the time's ignorance, but it certainly helped. And I think that's the same thing that Von Daniken had going for him, because what he was publishing in the 60s. The 60s. So the field is obviously developed, and it's in its phase before its current phase anyway.
Yeah, but I guess
it's still inaccessible to the average person.
I think you make a really good point there, Sarah, that today if any 14-year-old hearing on cable that, wow, there are pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic, all you've got to do is Google Egyptian pyramid, Google Maya pyramid, get those photographs of those two kind of iconic symbols of the ancient world on your screen at the same time. And I think just about anybody with 20/20 vision and a little bit of common sense will look at those and go, well, those are not alike at all. Those are completely different looking. So even without, but yeah, you're right. 1882, you couldn't do that. And so that merely the fact that you could say, well, there are pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic, that was enough for people. They didn't need anything more than that, and they didn't have access to anything more than that.
Right, and Donnelly had a reputation, so there wasn't any good reason to not believe what he said until I guess he took his claims too far.
I mean, Donnelly was he's an interesting character, right? I mean, the guy, he was a politician. He was a very progressive politician. I think he worked for the 8-hour day and was one of the founders of a utopian community. And ended up as like lieutenant governor of Wisconsin. Ran on the People's Party. He was a member of the People's Party, which was a populist party, and actually ran for vice president of the United States. So he's an interesting guy. He's kind of a polymath, certainly politically way ahead of his time, but he has some interesting ideas that have not borne out. He also believed, that he was a catastrophist, and in another one of his books asserted that a comet crashing into the Earth, that's what caused the flood that destroyed Atlantis.
That would be Ragnarok, the age of fire and gravel.
You got it. And he also was an early believer in the notion that, talking about William Shakespeare again, that William Shakespeare didn't write any of his plays. He thought that there was a cipher, that there was like a code in Shakespeare's plays that showed that I think it was Francis Bacon actually had written the plays. I think that the interesting thing about Donnelly is he was a great inductive researcher. And by that, I mean, he never tested out any of his hypotheses. He just collected a whole lot of shit and then cherry picked, and whatever seemed to support the thesis that he had that he held near and dear to his heart, that's what he put together and that's what he published.
And I argue that you could get away with that in the late 1800s because it was the 1800s. There weren't a whole lot of ways that the average person or even a wealthy person really could verify some of these theories. But it was also completely acceptable to speculate like that. That was kind of how science worked back then.
Sure.
And it obviously has developed. You can't get away with that today, especially with things like Atlantis that we are talking about, because we've got so much technology these days and we have such high expectations for factual evidence these days that simply saying, I think or I feel strongly that this thing happened is not enough. Or like we discussed earlier before the program even started, I had a past life and I had a dream about said past life, and that past life said that I lived in Atlantis. That stuff just doesn't fly anymore.
Well, it doesn't fly among kind of, in the scientific community, but there are people who actually believe that.
And we're going to take a short break to hear a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back to further discuss Atlantis.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
And we are back where we're going to keep talking about Atlantis. So let's jump on to, I think we've talked historical Atlantis to death already. Let's talk about Atlantis in modern day. Oh, come
Yeah,
on.
the deal is, all right, so if we, going back 1 second to Donnelly, I mean, Donnelly is saying that Atlantis was this enormously powerful and sophisticated civilization and the source of everything. Things get weird after Donnelly. I mean, as weird as Donnelly may seem to me, things get even more bizarre after Donnelly. First of all, you have the Theosophists who, try as I might to understand what in the hell they're talking about. I fail every time. But there is a very a supremely paranormal take on lost continents, with Lemuria being the equivalent lost continent in the Pacific, and discussions of root races and giant hermaphroditic beings and astral jellyfish. So it's where you can argue Donnelly in terms of the physical evidence and whether or not this is true history. The Theosophists, these guys have to be taking LSD, because there's really very little you can say other than, oh, that's an interesting idea. But there is beyond, it's outside of the realm of science when they start getting these kind of revelations from another astral plane and start believing that, well, they actually lived previous lives on Atlantis. And so you have the Theosophists. And then you have Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce is the sleeping prophet, right? This guy who would dictate these, apparently have these visions while he was asleep. And some of these, many of them, related to the lost continent of Atlantis. The cool thing about Cayce's stuff is that it's a really nice reflection of how the fringe archaeology crowd, when they start talking about what happened in the past, is that they are trapped by their own temporal period. So in other words, and it's a lot like the ancient astronaut guys, is that when Cayce talked about the powers, the immense and advanced and sophisticated technologies on Atlantis that he saw, that he encountered in his dreams, the technologies he was talking about were technologies that were available in the middle of the 20th century when Cayce was talking about this stuff. So their nuclear powers, and they had airplanes, and the funny thing is they communicated with what appear to be like these hydraulic tubes, like the kind you get when you go to the bank and you're in the the drive-through, and they put
pneumatic tubes.
Yeah, the pneumatic tubes, right. And so it's like, that was a big thing, I guess, in the middle of the 20th century. But when Cayce talks about this enormous, precociously sophisticated civilization, he doesn't talk about iPhones or iPads or Apple Watches. They're never these technologies that are wickedly sophisticated from his context. They're just kind of stuff that was known and already available when he was alive. Of course, he's putting it back thousands of years, but it's like, that's crappy science fiction, if you ask me. Good science fiction is like guys like Arthur C. Clarke, who, writing in the 1940s, writes science fiction about communication satellites that didn't exist yet. And wow, that was amazing.
And that's the difference between sci-fi and people trying to predict the future. But we covered that in a previous episode. I don't remember the number, but the whole idea that when people are foreseeing the future, they never really get that creative with what's in the future. It's always technology that is currently available or is going to be available in the next, the foreseeable future.
In Star Trek Next Generation, it kind of looks like Geordie LaForge, the guy who LeVar Burton plays, and he's got this he wears like this air cleaner over his eyes because he's blind, that he's got something that looks suspiciously like an iPad. And that's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
But it's not like a laptop. It's not like, well, and hell, I mean, for how long when Captain Kirk opened his communicator, I had a cell phone for a while that kind of looked like that, a flip phone, right?
That was still my favorite phone.
Yeah. So it's like in those cases, those science fictions were at least kind of vaguely predicting things that actually were going to happen 30, 40, 50 years later. But in all of the descriptions of the great sophistication of Atlantis, They're not talking about stuff that's out of that really is in the future. It's all kind of current technology. But they're saying, oh, but they had it 10,000 years ago.
Right, and that's the only caveat is they say, oh, they're advanced, thinking, hey, today, we are advanced today. So if they were advanced, then they would have the same technologies that we have today,
right,
only umpteen thousand years ago.
Right, and so that's
however long.
And that's so it's kind of pitiful or pathetic that their vision of this incredibly sophisticated, enormously precocious civilization never kind of gets beyond what we already have in the present.
It's definitely less creative. It's a lack of creativity on the part of the person creating the story. You would think if you're going to go as far as to say that you're in contact with sophisticated beings, you could at least dream up some weird crap.
Better stuff.
They were doing this thing, and I don't understand what it was, but it had an egg and a rat head. I mean, at least come up with some way of conveniently explaining away why you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and ultimately, and again, we can't emphasize this enough, that these kinds of explanations of how the world worked in the past almost always denigrate the abilities of human beings all over the planet. It assumes that ancient people were basically dumb and that they needed somebody. They needed a Peace Corps, whether it was an extraterrestrial Peace Corps or an Atlantean Peace Corps or peripatetic ancient Egyptians, showing them the way that all of our ancestors were kind of dumb and primitive, but one culture, one genius culture, whether it's Atlantis or extraterrestrials, was needed to teach people agriculture, writing, monumental architecture. And again and again and again, it so underestimates the intelligence and creativity and imagination and skills of ancient people simply because, well, they're ancient.
Right. And it always surprises me how much people underestimate ancient man, especially the farther back you get. And it's like, I don't think you understand how incredibly sophisticated they were. I mean, yeah, you see stone tools and you're like, oh, it's a rock. Anybody can do that. And I challenge you to go forward and do that because I can't and I understand what they did. It took a lot of smarts to get us to where we are today, and it took a lot of smarts back then to just live.
Right. And it's
constantly underestimating them is just kind of insulting to not only yourself but to the human race in general.
Yeah, we can call it temporal chauvinism. Yeah, we have to remember that the human brain, as far as we know, size and configuration of our brains today, shows up in the paleoanthropological record nearly 200,000 years ago. So these guys, if you were to take a 200,000-year-old anatomically modern Homo sapiens and magically transport him as a baby to the present, that baby would be indistinguishable from any other baby on the planet and would learn and would be as smart and as capable as any modern human baby. So the ability, and we were talking about this before as well, is that in a way, technology, our sophisticated technology, in a sense, makes us stupider. It does. I rail about this all the time. That I've rented cars. The Jeep I drive is like 10 years, 11 years old. But I've rented cars with all the bells and whistles because that's what they give you. And I refuse to use a backup camera on an automobile. God damn it! I've been driving for a long time. I know how to back up a stinking car, and I don't.
I love the backup
I don't need a backup camera.
I love it. And I love heated seats. Well, come on.
Right, heated seats I'm going with. I'm okay with that. But these cars that will park themselves. And again, when I got my license, I had to goddamn well learn how to parallel park. But what technology is doing is it's removing from us the need to perfect a skill. And so, we are, in a sense, becoming not stupider, but less and less capable. Ancient people relied on their smarts to survive every day. And so those who didn't ended up dead in a hurry. So these folks were every bit as intelligent as we are, and faced with challenges, they rose to those challenges.
Now, we can continue to have a transhumanistic discussion here if you want, because I am a big fan of technology, and I see it as replacing old skill sets and opening up new ones. But the argument still stands that our ancestors were a lot better at surviving and problem solving, I think, just because they had to be. They didn't have Siri, they didn't have Google, they didn't have parallel parking for them in their awesome heated seated cars. But they were very good at locating water. They were very good at finding locations for where to live. And they did not have the ability to create even a rudimentary computer to help them make these decisions. So this is all knowledge based. It's rote memory. And that is just not, and we're working with the same brains,
right,
like you said, but those skills are not skills that you see in modern, well, at least in modern Americans, because we're just not taught to use it, and we don't have to use it, so we don't. It's a muscle, and it atrophies.
Hey, listen, in my desire to piss off all of our listeners who complain about our tangents, I got a really cool tangent. Fairly recently, I read, and I wish I could. I will find the reference that there are a number of archaeologists who are now using folks who are traditional hunters and trackers to help them understand ancient, preserved, fossilized human footprints. Yeah, and in a couple of cave sites, they've actually brought them. These are people who are living in traditional cultures where they do a lot of hunting and a lot of tracking, and they've brought them into these caves and said, all right, here are these human footprints. What do they mean? And in some cases, they are coming up with hypotheses that then are testing out as, in fact, accurate as to how many people were actually there. They're able to distinguish the footprints between different folks. And I think that's a really good example of a traditional culture, people who the average person might say, well, they're living a primitive way of life. But look at how sophisticated their knowledge is of something that they rely on for their survival. And
go ahead.
Yeah, and so I'm just saying that ancient people, when they needed to start a fire, when they needed to bring water to their fields, when they needed a calendar that would allow them to keep track of the seasons and know when to plant and when to harvest, man, they had to be good at that, or they would not have survived.
And I think the other problem that we're having is, because I completely agree with you, is that we as a society have been taught to value IQ, the intelligence quota, as a measure of actual intelligence, when we really don't have a good anything to quantify intelligence itself. Because I've seen several studies that show, because we always think of primitive, and I hate using the term primitive, but of traditional societies as being less complex or stupid or poor or any kind of negative words you want to attach to that, and having lower intelligence because they can't pass an IQ test, which why would they?
Right, exactly.
But the difference is you take those same people and you say, okay, I need to find this animal in this amount of time, and I have to kill it in the most effective way possible. And I need to know how long that meat's going to last my village or just my family. And they can do all that in their head. They memorize everything. Like you were saying, they could identify from the footprints how many people were there, what they were doing, where they were going, blah, 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 blah. I'm probably stretching that a bit, but they can track animals like that. And they memorize where the migration paths of these animals are. They know what time of the year is the best time to go after them. They can identify by sight a good animal versus an animal that you don't want to hunt down. I mean, that's a lot. That's not something that the average person, the average modern society person could do. And probably couldn't be taught anymore either.
Yeah. To continue this tangent, I saw
right.
Well, not that long ago, a couple days ago, I saw a show on some cable network, and essentially it's this competition. these, I don't know, it's like a half a dozen men are dropped independently and in different places, I think somewhere in British Columbia. And they can only like bring 5 tools with them, and it's, will they survive? And you see these guys, and they make this whole this issue about it's very dangerous. There are wild animals, and these guys are good in, they're competent in nature. And I'm watching it going, my God, the place that these guys are making a big deal about, Native Americans have lived there for the last 11,000 years, and they did perfectly well. They didn't. They didn't make a TV show about how, oh my God, they could die any minute.
And
yeah?
Those are white people. It is kind of impressive for white people to do that. I just want to throw that out there.
Well, you know what?
Sorry.
Send those emails should go directly to Sarah. By the way,
it's all right. I will take the hate mail. I'm all right with it. Okay, so back to Atlantis.
Yes.
In a
circuitous way, we've come back to Atlantis.
In the 8 minutes we have before we go to break again. So modern Atlantis, jumping away from Ignatius, actually Van Deniken does touch on Atlantis, and he I think starts to make the alien connection. I don't think he goes as far as to say that it is a planet out in the middle of nowhere, but doesn't he make the claim that Atlantis was like one of the first settlements that the aliens came to? One of his numerous claims about how aliens got to the planet.
I can't say for sure, but there are so many claims in so many of his books.
Right.
I'm not going to say that he never said that, but I mean the thing is it's kind of a perfect scenario that it's this ultimate, like it's turtles all the way down. It's like this endless circle of, well, if the Egyptians couldn't have been smart enough and the Native Americans weren't smart enough, they learned it from Atlantis. But wait a minute. Where did the Atlanteans get it from? Well, maybe they got it from outer space. Or where did they get it from? Well, they got it from somebody else in outer space. And you just go on and on and on and on, never accepting the possibility that maybe people can figure this stuff out for themselves. And that's another important point. We've made this point before, that when you look at the archaeological record of the old and new worlds, and you look at the appearance of agriculture, the appearance of writing, the appearance of monumental architecture, these things don't show up, wham, instantaneously in the archaeological record. Despite the claims
that Von Daniken and others like him do make, because I have seen them make that argument,
and
especially with the pyramids and with agriculture. They make the claim that these things just appeared out of nowhere and were complete thoughts out of whole cloth. And it's like, no, we can trace the development of the pyramids. And we can trace the development of most of the technologies that people use.
Absolutely. So that the development of agriculture is not something that happens overnight. It happens over millennia.
Yeah.
We see the very slow development. We see, for example, animals that appear no longer to be living in the wild. They appear to be tended, but as far as their DNA, as far as their osteology, they still look like the wild animals. So that's the first step, the penning of these animals. And then we slowly see the development through artificial selection, the development of domesticated species. And it happens not over days or decades or even centuries. It happens over millennia. That's not what the archaeological record should look like if the Atlanteans from on high stooped down to
and bequeathed.
And said, well, here you go. Here's agriculture. Follow the directions on the back of the seed packet. You'll be fine. And the same thing is true of pyramids. The Giza pyramids, the triad, the wonders of the ancient world. They don't just show up on the Giza plateau. There's at least 4 or 5 generations of pyramid building before that, where we see mistakes and errors and screw ups, and they get bigger and bigger. We see that in Egypt. We see that in Mesoamerica. We see that among the mound builders in the Monk's Mound, which is the largest and probably the most impressive earth pyramid platform in North America, is not the first of these earthworks. It's the culmination of a long period of development of larger and larger earthworks, that required more people working together for a longer period of time. So again, the archaeological record very clearly reflects a slow fits and starts, trial and error development. It doesn't reflect snapping the fingers. The Peace Corps shows up and teaches people how to do this stuff.
I'm really digging this idea of an alien Peace Corps, though, because I'd like to apply. I think I could be very beneficial as a representative. Anyway,
we'll work on that one, Sarah.
Yeah, but I do like the idea of an alien Peace Corps. I'm going to use that from now on. As far as the archaeological record is concerned, and the whole having evidence, I want people to be aware that when we're talking about the archaeological record, we're not just talking about physical handheld artifacts. We are also talking about the footprints and the scarring that these kind of practices will leave on the surface of the earth and in the dirt that we've only recently really, well, since the 70s, I guess it's not that far, I mean, not that recent, but since the 70s, we've been able to really kind of penetrate the earth with ground penetrating radar and the magnetometers and all the other things that we use. We like to electrocute the ground a lot. And it allows us to see, like with my experiences out at Angel Mound, we were able to actually discern the different periods of building on Mound A, which is the largest mound out there. And it's got 2 different platforms plus a conchial kind of observation tower thing going on. We never were able to figure out what the hell that thing was. But we can see through the use of the magnetometer how many times they built it. And then when we actually did put units into it, we were able to discover the different floors as they prepared the surface of the mound for the next phase of the building. And it wasn't like, they built this platform and then they prepared it and then they built another platform and then they prepared it. It was a gradual process. It took, I don't know, I don't remember exactly how long it was inhabited out there, but that mound was built on from the moment that they founded that city to the time that they abandoned it. There was repairs done on it because it's an earth mound. Water's going to make it slump in some areas and wash away in others. So there was a lot of repair going on. So it was a very important mound for them. But we can see that now using technology that allows us to see more than just, hey, I found a flake. Hey, I found a piece of pottery. Hey, I found a trench. What's it mean? And I guess I'm on a pet peeve lately about this whole picture artifact porn stuff where they just put up pictures of really pretty things that they found in the dirt. And it's like, yeah, that's great. But what's the dirt look like? What's this whole site look like? And I want people to stop doing that because I want you to talk about the site overall and not the individual artifacts. Right. Sure. There, I said it.
There you go. You put it out there. But
yeah, we both got a rant this time.
But the point you're making is really important. Is that our technology today allows us to look at the finished product that is
thank you.
Angel Mound and say that's not something that happened overnight. That's not a one-shot deal. We can see the sequence that was employed over decades, perhaps centuries, as this got larger and larger and more sophisticated. So what you're looking at the end point of a long continuum. And when you look at the end point and go, how could they have done that? They didn't do it all at once.
And we can do the exact same thing using the exact same technologies to discover the building processes of the pyramids, the building processes of the Mesoamerican pyramids. We've used the technology on the standing statues on the Easter Island, and we've used the same technology on Stonehenge, which is how they've discovered the different different periods of building out at Stonehenge.
Right.
So
when enough people working together for a particular project and they really want to get that thing completed and they're working for a long enough period of time, it's amazing what people can do. And what's much more interesting is not, could it have been astronauts or could it have been Atlantis? It's what would motivate people to work that hard for something that isn't putting food in their bellies? What motivates people? And that's when we start thinking about, religion and social stratification and political power. Right. How does that happen? Those are the real mysteries, right? Is that if you have for a long time, human beings lived in basically egalitarian societies, and I know that's not necessarily absolutely accurate, but basically people had control over their own lives and nobody was the boss of them. Until we come to, and eventually we get to cultures in which, no, there's a supreme boss who can banish you or put you in jail or kill you if you don't do his or her bidding. And how do we get that way as a species from, listen, we're all kind of, we're doing our thing. We help each other out. We help out family, to where, no, there's a hierarchy, that there's a one percenters. Back in the Occupy Wall Street a couple of years ago.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah, a 1%.
The one percenters. Well, guess what? Pharaoh and his family, they were the one percenters.
It's not a new thing.
The Montezuma and his family, they were the one percenters. So the interesting question, a very interesting question for archaeologists and anthropologists and cultural geographers and historians to ask is, how did human beings as a species evolve cultures all over the world in which there's all this disparity in terms of wealth, all this inequality in terms of power and control? How did that happen? And that's a hell of a lot more interesting than, extraterrestrials land on the Earth and say, build me a pyramid. Well, okay.
Well, it gives you way more insight into modern culture. But, that people who are looking at Atlantis as an end-all be-all and as the mother of all culture, they're not interested in modern in how modern culture got the way it is. They've got this pie in the sky, fantasy world that they think existed, that they think is better, that it's a utopia for them, and that's what they want that to be real because they need it, maybe. Anyway, we need to go. Yeah. We need to go on break real quick, and when we get back, we will we'll be talking a little bit more about this stuff. So.
All right.
The Archaeology and Ale podcast presents a monthly series of lectures on all aspects of archaeology. These lectures are part of the Archaeology in the City program, hosted by the University of Sheffield in England, and are held at the Red Deer pub near the end of the month. The podcast can be heard a few days later. Check out the Red Deer if you're in the area, or find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the show.
All right, we're back, and we're going to wrap up our discussion on Atlantis. So, last points that you want to hit on, Ken?
Well, this is my own silly analogy, all right? And I walk into a classroom, and I tell the students, hey, look, I'm going to tell you a story today, and it's a story about a very, very sophisticated culture that lived a long time ago in a place far, far away. And they were enormously powerful, but evil. They were an evil empire. And their goal was to defeat and control the entire universe that they had been in contact with. And they had a tremendously advanced military, and they were economically wealthy, but they were evil. They were bad. And there was only one thing standing in the way of their total domination. That is, there was a small ragtag group who, though they weren't as powerful, weren't as rich, not as sophisticated, but nevertheless, they were a righteous people. You might say, I don't know, the Force was with them. And I asked the students, I said, well, what story have I just told? And they said, well, come on, we're not idiots. That was the story of Star Wars. And I go, oh, no, that's not Star Wars. That's it. That's the story of Atlantis. And they go, what? Yeah. Because that's exactly what it is. Star Wars is merely a science fiction version in the future of the Atlantis story that Plato tells through the surrogate of Critias the Junior. So it's all about, when Plato places Atlantis 10,000 years in his past, so long ago, and he puts it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, far away,
far
right?
Away.
And the empire that he talks about is what it's just as a sidebar. A lot of folks, when they talk about Atlantis, they go, yes, but Plato was talking about the perfect society, Atlantis. And I say, God, go back and read your Plato, because
Yeah.
Atlantis is the evil empire. They're
Right.
the plot
That's
device.
a lot of people miss that.
Absolutely. It happens all of the time.
Because they're always like, oh, Atlantis is good vibes and it's healing crystals and
Yes.
and erudite people coming to teach us all how to be happy, lovey, joy. And it's like, no, they were trying to conquer the world.
Atlantis, they were the badass. Atlantis
Yeah.
is Darth Vader and those guys, because it's an ancient and equally mythical Athens of 10,000 years before Plato that is the good guys. They're the ones living the perfect society. They're the ones who are standing. They are able, despite the fact that Atlantis is more economic, is wealthier, militarily more powerful, technologically more sophisticated than the Athenians. The Athenians are living the perfect, blameless life, just as Socrates, Plato described it in the Republic, and they are able, through the pure force of their goodness, to defeat the Atlanteans, and then the gods see that what's happened, and they're the ones who caused this huge flood to wipe out and destroy Atlantis forever. So the story that Plato tells is a story that George Lucas retells in Star Wars. Now, just like nobody is going to watch those Star Wars movies and say, wait a minute, maybe they're preparing us for something. Maybe this actually happened. Well, hell no, we know it's a fiction. And
Well, because it tells us that at the beginning of the movie.
There's no Jar Jar Binks. There's no Luke Skywalker. They're made up characters. With the same token, we really shouldn't be so fixated on the reality of Atlantis. It wasn't real. It's an allegory for how a society, when faced with an existential challenge, rises to the occasion, defeats its enemy, and does so because they are living a way of life that, in this hypothetical perfect society, reflects the way all people should be living. That's the message. It's a ripping good story. Read Critias, read Timaeus. As philosophies go, it's a pretty good piece of work. It's pretty exciting. But Plato was a philosopher, not a historian or an archaeologist. He was a philosopher, and that's the point of his work, is to teach us moral lessons. And that's what that works. The
Atlanteans were bad guys.
They're the bad guys. They're the evil empire in this story. They're the ones. It's good that they're destroyed because they are bad. They are evil.
They're the ones with the skulls on their uniforms.
Exactly so. Their uniforms are black. Well, I guess the stormtroopers are white as well. Never mind. So we're not going to go there. But
I was going to say that this is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, I think so.
We don't have time for that.
And here's the deal. I've done a bunch of little talking head TV bits for National Geographic, History Channel, the Discovery Channel, BBC, and a bunch of others. And if I add up all the ones that I've done over the last 20 years, I would say two-thirds of them are all about Atlantis. Atlantis is the abiding theme in these shows, and it shows up again and again and again. And for the life of me, it's a cool story, but I just don't get it. I really don't. Literally within the last 3 months, I have been interviewed for a Japanese cable TV show about Atlantis. They sent a film crew to my lab, and I met them after field school. We were doing really cool archaeology, and they wanted to know about Atlantis, which just totally blew me away. And at the same time, I am serving as a consultant for a kid's book. These folks contacted me saying, well, you're an expert on Atlantis. We're doing a kid's book on Atlantis. Could you please serve as a consultant? So that there's something about the story that people just find so engaging and so riveting, it never goes away.
I will say that the story of Atlantis, as it has developed from Donnelly onwards, it's a cool story. I mean, there's a lot there. There's the ultimate good. There's the promise. I mean, there's the promise of advanced technology. There's the promise of, depending on where you go, forever life, knowledge of everything, forbidden knowledge. I mean, the way Atlantis has developed is it means so many different things to so many different people. And I'm not defending the story. I'm not defending Atlantis, but I can see why people like it as a story. What I don't get is how people take it from that, oh, what a cool story step, to, oh no, this is real. And the alien angel lizard people are eventually going to come back and take us all away to some crystal cavern to live forever. And it's like, no, they're not.
Well, maybe it is. You're right. I think it's that longing for a golden age where everything was better, where everything was rainbows and unicorns. Yeah. And there really were people like that. But then the maddening thing is, again, if that's what you want, you don't want Atlantis. They're the bad guys. They're the evil empire. Find your great golden age somewhere else. Because that, if you're going to embrace Plato, he made that really freaking clear. They're the bad guys. They're the bad guys who the gods destroy at the end because they're bad.
I wonder what made Donnelly decide to go with Atlantis as being the Ubermensch and not, what is it, not Atlantis, who are the Athenians.
Right. Well, because the Atlanteans are so much. There's so much more sex appeal there.
Apparently,
this huge navy, and all, the walls of their cities are covered in this metal orichalcum, and they've got these beautiful ships that they sail all over. So it's just like what people don't. I think that Plato was using all that for an ironic purpose. That is, yes, they had all those wonderful material things, and it didn't. Look what had happened. They fell in love with the material things that they lost the godly part. And but we're all. It says we're all so much into cool, awesome, nifty technology that we see that and we go, oh, that's what I want to be, an Atlantean. I want to live on Atlantis.
Yeah. It's the same reason why people want to be stormtroopers.
I guess.
Like, I don't understand that. Why do you want to be? I get that somebody has to play the bad guy every once in a while. I get that. But why would you volunteer? Because you like it. Anyway, I think we may have. We may not have covered everything about Atlantis. I'm sure I will get more questions. And by all means, send me your questions and requests about Atlantis or anything else. We are taking requests. We are working on that, and we will be getting to shows that have topics that have been requested here in the future. But I think we ranted pretty well, too. I think we both got a good one in. So if you have questions about our rants, send your hate mail to Chris at APN Network.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Anyway.
Chris will very much appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. But seriously, if you guys have questions or comments, please feel free to email us at the show. It's archifantasies@gmail.com. And Ken, is that your last thought?
Yeah, that's it. I think we have sunk that island. Okay.
And yes, I think so. I think we have definitely pelted it with a comet of truth.
Oh my God. The comet, the dreaded comet of truth.
Dreaded comet of truth.
All right, cool. Well, it's been real. It's been a slice. Looking forward to the next one.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
Right, bye.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology, are the study of archaeology.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosoup Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
But we don't do dinosaurs.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle and was edited by Josh Phoebus.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. Raise your trowels as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.